single, undercover black father sheltered a weeping pregnant stranger with his last gas money and a sandwich, unaware she was a disguised CEO millionaire. "You look like you lost everything," he said softly, offering the coin he had meant for his child's milk. The rain had started as a soft hush, a trembling mist that painted the night in gray. It swelled quickly into a relentless hammering against the plastic awning of the gas station, each drop tattooing the sodium-lit pavement with trembling silver, and the cold seemed to reach into Bones' bones as if the sky had decided to be unkind in sympathy with his weathered hands. He stood beneath the flickering light, jacket collar up, fingers white around a paper cup of coffee that was more hope than warmth, and the air smelled of wet pavement and the faint metallic tang of motor oil. His daughter's blanket lay folded in the front seat of his worn sedan, a threadbare blue bundle that smelled like home and dinner-time stories, and he watched the world shrink into puddles that reflected a street lamp's golden glow with an apologetic shimmer. The station clerk's fluorescent light buzzed, the kind of sterile silence that made people speak less and inhale more, and somewhere inside his chest a memory rose. A lullaby his mother used to hum while she mended socks by a lone lamp, and his heart thudded wildly. He did not know it yet, but the exchange he was about to make, the coin he was about to offer, would change the course of every aching hour that followed. He walked toward the trembling figure by the pump, the soles of his shoes whispering on wet asphalt, and the scene felt like the universe had conspired to compress all sorrow into a single, trembling moment. "Please, don't stare," she whispered, though the words were carried away by the rain as if the world itself refused to eavesdrop on grief. He answered with a quiet chuckle, because it was the only thing he could afford besides pity. "I'm not staring," he said, and the too long, one short rhythm of his speech landed against the hush like a small, steady drum. He could have walked away. He could have driven to the corner store, bought the milk that kept his baby's coughing quiet, and let the night keep its secrets. But there was a certain geometry to kindness that had been wired into him by years of needing the same. He saw the hollow in the stranger's eyes and knew hunger by how it hollowed the mouth. He saw pregnancy in the way her jacket couldn't hide the soft, unsteady roundness at her middle and something in his chest, something that had been folded and put away during late shifts and unpaid bills, unfurled like a flag. He fumbled for his wallet as if the act of opening it would make the world whole again. He counted coins, not much. A quarter, 2 dimes, a single dollar. The last dollar he had intended for gas. He folded a battered receipt into his palm. The paper creased where he'd paid for a hot meal he didn't get to eat, and he offered what he could. She looked at him with glistening, wet eyes that were not innocent but were unflinching, and when she accepted, the relief was a small sound that broke from her like a bird freed from a cage. "Thank you," she breathed, and the syllables seemed to land in his ribs. He noticed details with a practiced tenderness. The way her scarf frayed at the edges, the faint indent of a locket beneath her sweater, the way her hands trembled when she folded the dollar into them. He saw sorrow as a texture, threadbare, worn, trembling, and he recognized in it a kinship. He handed her a sandwich he had wrapped in wax paper that morning, the bread slightly stale but wrapped with a love born of necessity. "You need to eat," he said. The words were a simple currency. They bought him a moment of human exchange that felt like a small miracle. She took it with a hesitation that was almost reverential. "You shouldn't have," she said, voice raw. "You shouldn't be giving this to me." He managed a smile that was steady in spite of the tremor in his fingers. "My daughter sleeps better when I know I did something good today," he said. "And maybe someone did that for me once." The rain hammered with a new insistence as if it wished to be part of the confession. Her jaw clenched, her chest tightened. She tasted like salt and something sweeter, the remnant of emotion and fear. "My name is Bone," he added, "because names are anchors. People call me Bone 'cause I'm stubborn," she laughed once. A short, surprised sound, and the laugh refracted in the light like glass. They didn't exchange phone numbers, they didn't touch fingers, they simply parted ways. Him to his sedan, her to the edge of the parking lot where a small figure awaited beneath torn foil and a tattered blanket, and the world resumed its practical motions. He drove away thinking of the lullaby his mother once hummed, of small hands searching for his face in the dark. He told himself he had done a right thing and that would be enough, though he knew enough to know life rarely paid debts in tidy currencies. Yet he felt a warmth that evening, like the soft hush of a blanket, that settled in his chest. He did not know it then, but someone with a cavernous mansion and gleaming marble floors was watching, taking note with a private, steady gaze. Someone whose grief had been armored with wealth and silence. Someone who had once thought power could replace tenderness. It was an old hurt in a new body. A man who had learned to hide behind crisp suits and quiet boardrooms. He would not understand himself until much later, but at this moment, he would begin an emotional journey from icy indifference back to awe because of the smallness of a sandwich and the sincerity of that offering. He would, in time, become the kind of person who used power not to command but to cradle. He would be the hidden savior, and this was the seed. Part 1. Bone had been practicing resilience since before the word meant anything. Resilience had been taught to him by a mother who stitched hope into small gestures and by an old man who ran the corner store and taught him to balance hope as one might balance change. Precisely, tenderly. Bone's life was a ledger of debts and credits measured not in dollars but in degrees of mercy. He worked nights as a janitor at an outpatient clinic, a job that required a steady hand and an understanding that certain rooms hold on to people's breaths long after they leave. By day he was Darius, the patient father who traded laughter for the hush of his daughter's nap. He was black, yes, his skin a testimony to lineage and sun, to the way the world perceived him before it knew his name. He was, more importantly to him, a single father, a stitch in a patchwork family who read stories with voices that turned dragons into riddles. He thought often of his daughter, Maya, a small, bright creature with a laugh that could make even the most stubborn lamp seem to glow a little softer. She slept on a blanket patched by his mother with a care that was almost sacred, and she had a tattered rattle that sounded like a wind chime in the hands of a storm. Bone kept a note folded into the glove compartment of his car where he'd written, in shaky pen, "One day we'll sleep in a place that smells like cinnamon." It was not a plan but a promise. That promise hollowed him and filled him with equal measure. The hunger of fatherhood made him both fierce and humble. He carried with him the visible markers of his life. A faded receipt from a second-hand store tucked between pages of a novel, a coin that had been his father's, a key with no lock and a name with no accent. He had been fired twice in the last 3 years, once for a misunderstanding with a manager who valued profit over people, once because the clinic reorganized and there was no space for a man who juggled night shifts with early school pickups. Each loss was a small bruise that healed into a map of cautionary lines. He took whatever work he could find. Cleaning floors, changing light bulbs in the dead hours, picking up trash at the park after Sunday's games. He knew the city by the sounds of its insomniac heartbeat, the hollow echo of the subway, the soft chuckle of a baker kneading dough at dawn, the distant hum of someone else's TV late at night. He knew hunger intimately, and he knew the pride that refused to let you ask for more than you gave away. The gas station encounter was an ordinary miracle. To a passerby, it would look like a simple, transient act, a man giving money to a crying pregnant woman. But in Bone's world, gestures ripple. He noticed the way her shoulders hunched. He saw her fingers twist the edge of a scarf. He heard a sharp little cough when she thought no one was listening. He was changed not by grandeur but by the nakedness of human need. He fed her like he would a sibling or a stray animal, with what was immediate and available. When he walked back to his car, the rain had got a little harder, the windshield smeared with drips that streaked like tears. He thought of the word shelter and felt its weight. Unbeknownst to him, the woman, who would later be revealed under a different light, was in a different arena entirely. The woman, who called herself Leah in the small, uncertain world of the gas station, was actually Leonora Hale, CEO of Hale Industries, though at that night she bore no sign of corporate crispness. She bore only fatigue. Leonora's life had been a parade of polished people and silent corridors where power is spoken rather than felt. She had inherited a company and a loneliness that sat in the center of her chest like a cold coin. Her true identity was a paradox, a public, gleaming persona and a private, fragile heart. The boardrooms in the city's towers found her impeccable, her voice measured, her decisions sure. The private rooms found her waterless, a person who had been practicing composure until composure itself felt like armor. She had been traveling undercover that week, a decision born not of whim but of an aching curiosity to test whether anyone would see her if she dressed as a person without pedigree. So she took transit, bought cheap coffee from vendors, slept on a friend's couch, and, on an impulsive night, she left a fundraiser early and walked into the rain. Her outfit that night had been a thrift store jacket, an unremarkable hat, a pair of shoes that had been resold more than once. She had known hunger in a way she had never said aloud, an emptiness that belonged not to the belly but to the soul. She hadn't expected to be in labor. She hadn't intended pregnancy to be a headline or to have a timing that the world found dramatic. But there she had been. A human with a pulse that quickened in strange, private rhythms, hands that sought a railing and found only damp metal. She didn't want assistance. What she wanted was confirmation that compassion still existed when social currency was stripped away. The city had a way of hiding both saints and sinners, and she wanted to see the line between them without the blur of press releases. Bone drove home that night with the taste of the sandwich and the small satisfaction of having done a right thing. In the momentary, breathless quiet of his car's interior, he imagined future nights where his daughter had a baked pie on the counter and a lamp that didn't flicker. He had not yet considered the possibility that a life could fold toward his without a ledger. Bones are structure and support. That is what his name promised. He would protect his small world with the only thing he had in ample supply, an unwavering kindness. When he pulled up to the building where he rented the second-floor unit with a kitchen the size of a shoebox, he noticed a shadow near the alleyway, a human shape crouched under cardboard that suggested more than the need for shelter. It suggested exhaustion so complete it had stopped worrying about dignity. He slowed to a crawl and offered a wave. The figure looked up and offered only a tired smile. Sometimes, the small echoes of generosity return like birds to a feeder. This opening sequence set the pattern of Bone's life, carefully deliberate acts with outsized emotional returns. He had cultivated a modest, quiet dignity about him. He never spoke of his difficulties without first ensuring his daughter would have bread. He had the kind of resolute, steady presence that made neighbors nod and trust grow without spectacle. His poverty was not theatrical. It was precise and weary. He mended shoes with glue and patience, he cut coupons, and he painted small murals on the walls of his child's nursery to make it feel vast. He was present for the things that mattered. Scraped knees, parlor tricks, answering why with, because we make our own luck. People in his life described him as gentle in a way that suggested strength disguised as softness. Leah, meanwhile, began a private chain of decisions that would intertwine her fate with Bones. She had not planned on connecting the way she did. She had simply wanted to learn humility in the old-fashioned way, by being reduced to the bare bones of existence. It was a test of her own capacity for noticing. Her life had been gilded and meticulously arranged, but this experiment had peeled back the gilding to reveal a person who had been taught to perform grief as one might perform a speech, measured and rehearsed. Being under the gas station's awning made her aware of how fragile human faces can be in the dark, how each one carries an atlas of small misfortunes. Her identity, that she would later reveal in a cavernous office that smelled of cedar and power, was not a badge she wore at the pump. It was a coat that had been removed for warmth. That night, the city wrapped itself in a bleak lullaby. Bone lay awake listening to his daughter's soft breaths and remembered promises his mother had made him in low voices beside a small lamp. He listened to the silence like it was a patient friend waiting to hear whether he had done right. He had. That was as far as the ledger could go. He did not know yet that the ledger would be rebalanced by a woman whose hands had once penned checks and board resolutions, who had an ironclad privacy about her personal losses, and who would, in time, rediscover tenderness because of the simplicity of his act. He also did not know that his quiet resolve would test him. Setbacks beget setbacks, as if suffering had an appetite for repetition. The story had opened its first door. He had stepped across the threshold unaware of the bright, sometimes searing light that waited beyond. Part 2. The next morning, Bone woke to a city that smelled faintly of burnt toast and regret. He made coffee with the method of someone who measures comfort in small rituals. A tin pot on an electric coil, water poured with the deliberation of a prayer. He tied his daughter's hair with a ribbon that had been his wife's before she left, a small relic that reminded him of a love that had frayed but not vanished. He hummed the lullaby under his breath as he fed Maya her cereal, and the domestic scene felt like an improvised liturgy. Bowls clinked, a soft silence cradled their words, and the home, though threadbare, felt whole. He folded the blanket and kissed the child's hair. "Don't tell the rain we're running out of hope," he joked, "because humor is scaffolding." And she laughed with a candor that felt like sunshine in a storm. At the clinic that night, the fluorescent lights had secrets that only night workers knew. They showed dust like galaxies and revealed the tiredness in people's shoulder blades. Bone moved like a man who was careful because care was his livelihood. He swept floors, closed off examination rooms, and listened to the soft ticking of a wall clock like it was counting blessings. The clinic's patients were people with the same brittle dignity as himself. The old woman who came twice a week for checkups, the teenager who needed a word of kindness, the veterans who measured grief against prescription bottles. Bone's work had the quiet hum of being essential. It left him a little battered and a lot grateful. Leah, in the days after the gas station, found that her experiment had not been a single night but a diagnosis. She kept replaying the small hand-to-hand exchange where a man had given her the world in a folded dollar and a sandwich. It lodged in her like a splinter that wouldn't let her ignore it. She had returned to her boardroom the next week and found herself distracted, the minutes of a meeting falling like loose coins through a crack beneath her heel. She scheduled a charity visit she did not feel she deserved, asked questions she did not fully believe in, and then canceled at the last minute because something in her had shifted. The company had been looking for new directions, for a philanthropic arm that smelled less like publicity and more like hunger being filled in private. In her insomnia, she drafted memos that felt like flattery to no one. Bones next week made him live the ledger. He fixed a neighbor's leaky sink in exchange for extra rice for the month. He sorted through old clothes to find something warm for Maya. He patched a shoe at midnight for a small fee and felt both proud and ashamed of the tightness in his chest that came from never quite being enough. He began to notice people in his neighborhood the way he breathed, careful and frequent. His neighbor Mrs. Lopez offered him empanadas. They became a consolation prize for both of them, a mutual exchange of warmth for frayed dignity. He began to create a kind of safety network with the small currencies he could offer: kindness, practical advice, a babysitting hour in exchange for a load of laundry. The world, in his experience, tended to repay you with small kindnesses when you paid in truth. It had taught him a peculiar brand of optimism, persistent, measured, not naive. One evening, as the rain that had been a background instrument settled into a soft hush, Bone passed by a newsstand and caught sight of a headline that crystallized the city's attention. Hale Industries announces new CEO initiative. For a moment, the world felt like it could swallow his breath. He read the name and a photograph that showed a woman in a sleek blazer and an impeccable haircut. She looked like marble and wind and a global conference. He flicked the paper shut. He felt a hollow ache, thinking of the woman who had accepted his sandwich. It seemed impossible that the same hands that had folded a dollar beneath an awning could be the hands that signed paychecks into board accounts. But the city was full of small miracles disguised as coincidences. He folded the paper and slid it into his pocket, a small talisman that caught the light of his dreams. Leah found herself making more unplanned choices. She rode the subway in plain clothes one night to listen to a busker sing the blues without the mediation of a polished gala. She watched people the way a botanist studies rare flowers, close, patient, a little desperate. The night she had the encounter at the pump, she'd been testing an aloneness that had been curated by wealth. She had learned to divide her life into public and private, as if segmentation could inoculate her from tenderness. In the presence of a man who could give away his last dollar, she had felt something like a reawakening. It was seismic and tender and made her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. She had been hollow and now felt the slow filling in of something that had missed the weight of limits. Because fate favors the modest, their paths crossed again in a way neither could predict. Bone learned that the clinic where he worked had been invited to a community outreach event sponsored by none other than Hale Industries. The company wanted a grassroots image, a public giving with polished smiles and glossy pamphlets. Bone was skeptical. He had seen corporate philanthropy that looked generous on paper and hollow in practice. He had learned to read a polished smile the way one reads a recipe, with suspicion. Yet he attended, because the event offered free children's dental kits and a warm meal for volunteers. He did not know it then, but he was stepping into the same light that had once shown him a woman by a pump. The city, having a soft sense of irony, arranged that up close, the details that make people who they are, lines on a face, the particular angle of a laugh, could be invisible unless you decided to see. Leah was present at the event under a thin, deliberate anonymity. She had not planned for the encounter to be emotional. She had planned it as a reconnaissance mission to learn how her company performed in the neighborhoods they claimed to serve. But when she saw Bone across the crowd, wiping tables, offering a small child an extra carton of milk, something in her recognition flickered. It was odd to notice a man who had been kind without expecting anything back and to feel the old, sleepwalked cynicism melt into awe. She watched him with an intensity that felt both scientific and oddly tender. He moved with a dignity that mattered and a cheerfulness that seemed honest. The way he opened his hands to help the little ones, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, suggested a story of someone who had been broken and had patched himself into a whole person again. They spoke briefly across a tray of donated food. He offered her a stale cookie, and she accepted, and they laughed. She asked him, in that quiet, generous way she had learned from the awning, how he managed to maintain joy. He answered with a lesson in small economies. "I keep my daughter fed and my promises in the same place," he said. "It helps me sleep." She heard the thing she had been missing. People who lived their commitments rather than staged them for an audience. She felt a pang she didn't have the vocabulary for. The desire to be seen in the rawness of a quiet, unspectacular goodness. The emotional contact was like the sound of a bell that had been placed in a jar. The note hung in the air longer than she expected. After the event, Bone walked her to the subway where they spoke longer than polite small talk. A passing, intimate conversation unfurled. About reasons and losses, about the taste of thrift store coffee and the sound of lullabies. She spoke of a childhood that had been thorough in privilege but thin in tenderness. He spoke of a man who learned to be everything to one small person and that taught him to keep promises like a religion. She asked his name and he gave it. He asked hers and she said Leah, because names are honest when you mean them. They did not exchange numbers. They did not plan a future. Yet the world rearranged slower things. Their repeat sightings, the constellations of small acts that preface large changes. She left the subway and felt a warmth like a wound that had begun to heal. Bone left the event thinking about the folder of his daughter's preschool photos that had been on his fridge for months. He walked home with a sense of being both more and less than he had thought. He had a tiny flame of hope, the kind that people store in jars. He would keep it for as long as it took. He would patch any leaks. He would be steady. The city turned on its lights like a row of patient witnesses, and the rain quit as if in respect for a moment that had been shared. Part 3. Life, being indifferent and insistently practical, brought hardship not as a single storm but as a succession of rainfalls. Bone had made modest improvements to his life. A second job folded into the edges of the day, lessons in coupon clipping, a small summer plan for Maya. He believed in making daily vows and keeping them. To read 2 chapters every night, to make sure payments were made on time, to never lie down without having tucked his child in. But fate has a penchant for testing such vows. One morning he received a letter, crisp, stamped, and merciless, summoning him to an eviction hearing because the landlord had decided to sell the building to developers eager to carve out more profitable spaces. The notice felt like a cold hand on the back of his neck. He had always known that threadbare roofs could be ripped away. He had always known that the city loves to replace history with profit. He held the letter in trembling hands and imagined Maya's blanket lying on bare floorboards. His chest tightened to the point of pain. He had little recourse. He found himself making phone calls with a dignity that trembled. He visited legal aid, where a receptionist with kind eyes arranged a temporary meeting. He pleaded with the landlord, a man who seemed to wear impatience like a suit, The landlord's reply was crisp and impersonal. The building had a buyer, the papers were signed, and the law favored the highest bidder. Bone did not have the luxury of options. He had the slow, steady resourcefulness of someone who had faith in the microeconomies of neighbors. "If we pull together, we'll pull through," his neighbor said, handing him a casserole dish. He became more guarded in the weeks after the notice. He worked overtime where he could. He asked old friends for favors with a humility that felt like begging, yet always he maintained a steady face for Maya. He would not let the child see the raw edges unless they were softened by a story. At night he dreamed of a house that smelled like cinnamon and pretended, so thoroughly in his imagination, that the pretend became, for a sliver of time, a fragile reality. He had thoughts of creative solutions that did not exist, of loans from faceless institutions that simply didn't return calls. The world had a way of turning human desperation into paperwork. Leah watched Bone from a distance that had the quality of recognition and curiosity. She had been aware, over the course of weeks and months, of how compassion looked up close. The small flinch when money was out of reach, the way pride reframed every request. She saw him in the clinic corridors when Hale Industries sent a small team to partner with the clinic on a community engagement initiative. She watched his hands as he wiped counters and how those hands stayed steady, even when the world asked more than he could give. Her own life had started to tilt. She had been a woman made of polished angles, the public persona of a CEO whose decisions swayed markets and whose signature could change livelihoods. But the private was messy and small and human. She had lost a partner years earlier in an accident, a fact she had protected from most of the world. That grief had been a fissure she learned to walk around. It had hardened into isolation and erudition and an apathy so precise that she could cut through speeches without emotion. The kindness at the gas station and the later recognition of a man by a clinic had unseated her carefully arranged interior. For the first time since the accident, she found herself wanting to resolve a problem not by issuing directives but by listening. When Bone's eviction notice became public among the small network of neighbors, the clinic staff rallied. They organized a fundraising dinner that was modest in scope but enormous in heart. They asked for donations from anyone who had a cup of generosity. Leah, listening with a heart that had been softened by seeing him move like a person who had been given a family, offered a donation. It seemed then, as it seems now, like a small act given her capacity, but it was not a performative donation. It was a step in a personal transformation. She wrote a check that night and added a note, "For lying blankets against the cold." Bone, when he heard of the fundraiser, refused to be more than an attendee. He had a humility that demanded silence. He stood in the back of the church-turned hall, shoulders a little hunched, and watched plates fill and hands clasp. He felt odd being the object of charity. Pride and need warred in his ribs. He felt gratitude and humiliation in equal measure, the combination of feelings like a bittersweet composition. He kept himself from attending to any more than was necessary. He counted the ways in which he had been contained. Soft words, less demand, gratitude. He would accept help because his daughter needed a bed that didn't sag. That was all he wanted. The fundraiser was a quiet symphony of small kindnesses. It was the kind of event where casseroles spoke volumes and people offered their services to patch roofs and minds alike. The organizers raised enough for a short reprieve, to pay for 2 months' rent and perhaps a deposit on a new place. The check arrived from a donor who refused a public thank you. Bone, upon learning this, cried once in his car, the sound muffled by wet upholstery and small gravel. He held the note and felt both like a supplicant and a beneficiary. Again the too long, one short rhythm of his life took hold. Give, accept, survive. He called Maya's aunt to arrange plans and thought about the ways the world is soft when it decides to be. What Bone didn't know, and what made the story of their lives strange and intertwined with fate, was that Leah had not written the check impulsively. She had done something for herself. She had recognized the purity in his act at the pump and had been profoundly moved by it. Seeing his dignity in the face of hardship had rekindled something in her grief-hardened heart. This act of writing a check was the beginning of a private intervention, one where she would watch from the dark and give without announcing herself. She had a complex relationship with gratitude. It felt like a weapon and a bomb. She decided she would not rescue him. She would not make a show. Instead, she would seed small kindnesses anonymously, allowing Bone the dignity of receiving without spectacle. So she began. She arranged for anonymous payments that landed in the clinic's funding account. She left groceries and a warm blanket with a note that said, "From a stranger who remembers being cold." She paid for after-school classes under a made-up name. Her wealth moved through the neighborhood like rain seeping into soil, quiet, penetrating. She signed as a friend. Each act was a confession and a cure. She watched from afar as a community rallied around Bone and marveled at the human networks that could be created with need, attention, and anonymity. Bone, meanwhile, felt the swell of help and thus the small, private humiliation of accepting it without being able to say thank you properly. But he also felt something he did not yet have words for. That the world sometimes returns the favor in ways that require you to keep your dignity intact. He tried to imagine who might have done it, but he did not know the face of the generous donor who had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that his child's warm sleep was a personal obligation. Lee's secret interventions were a kind of martyrdom of the heart. She did not tell her assistant or her board or anyone at Hale Industries. She feared contamination, the idea that her gesture might be consumed by the machinery of publicity. She created a private ledger of anonymous actions and taped it shut inside a desk. Each good deed made a sound in her chest like a small bell being rung for the first time. She was, in a way, being reformed not by grand gestures but by the echo of small mercies. She was learning that power could be used to serve rather than to command. She found herself physically lighter, as if grief, when met with a purpose beyond solitude, could be ameliorated. There is a curious cruelty in the way the world tests the pure-hearted. It often delivers public humiliation in the center of the town square. Bone would get his test not in the quiet back rooms but beneath the harsh lights of a corporate-sponsored event. It would happen later, when the antagonist, someone of impatience and elite cruelty, decided to make a spectacle. For now, the narrative hummed with the quietness of anonymous aid and the tentative steps of two people on different sides of the city's fabric moving closer not with fanfare but with the soft gravity of attention. They were building toward a converging point, like two tributaries that confide in silence before forming a river. Part 4. Lee's observation of Bone's life grew into a pattern of clandestine guardianship. She would sometimes park outside the clinic at dusk and watch through rain-streaked glass as Bone folded chairs and turned off lights, his silhouette a study in careful exhaustion. She never spoke to him about the gifts. She never left a trace more obvious than a folded napkin that read, "For warmth." The generosity she practiced was informed by her own sorrow. The loss of a partner had left a vacancy she could not name, one that wealth could not fill. She measured, with a private arithmetic, how much faith a person needed to keep moving forward. She invested her money the way she once invested in markets, with forethought, caution, and the hope of a return of a different kind. This peculiar act of watching and giving became, for her, a kind of therapy. It rewired old enzymes of grief into something more active. Bone continued his nights at the clinic, his days at work, and his life remained an elegant economy of will. He noticed small things changing. A different brand of cereal in the pantry, a hot meal waiting on a certain evening. He suspected a neighbor but could not name which. The community shielded him with the sacredness of small kindnesses. He rejoiced privately, for gratitude is quiet and complex, often felt in the throat where pride constricts. He felt cradled by anonymity and humbly vowed to himself that he would repay it when he could. Then came the public humiliation that would be the stage for the salvation to come. The antagonist, an embodiment of cruelty and impatience, entered the scene sharply. Her name was Lorraine Ashcroft, the wife of a developer who had taken a particular interest in the building that housed Bone's apartment. Lorraine was a woman of polished cruelty, a personality that thrived on being seen and on making others invisible. She attended community meetings with a smile like a polished dagger and made statements wrapped in the language of progress that, when translated, meant displacement. She had no patience for the softness of human needs, and treated them like inconvenient stains on a perfect shirt. She was the kind of person who believed the poor were slackers and the needy were convenient moral lessons. She believed that wealth conferred not just comfort but a license to enforce a certain public picture. Born into money, Lorraine had the skill of public humiliation down to an art form. She loved to speak loudly in public spaces, to make proclamations that would crush dignity like brittle porcelain. She saw Bones' eviction as nothing more than a game to be won, a demonstration of power, and she sought to make him a lesson. She arranged for a public walkthrough of the building the developers were to acquire. In her mind, it would be a spectacle. Cameras, press, a ribbon cutting where she would stand like an empress and declare the triumph of modern architecture. She intended to host it in the exact stairwell where Bones' floorboard had been squeakiest, where his daughter's lullaby was most likely to be heard. She wanted humiliation to be pedagogical. The day of the walkthrough arrived with a sky bright and cold, an amber hue that made everything look more severe. The stairwell smelled of old paint and the city. Lorraine strutted down the stairs in shoes that clicked like gavel strikes. Bone had been fetched by fate into the stairwell to receive the eviction notice in person. He stood with a dignity that made his posture seem more than his thin jacket allowed. He had kept his face steady because the city had taught him composure. He had not expected laughter. He had not expected the world to be so loud. Lorraine, with a microphone in hand and a smirk like a blade, began to speak to the assembled cameras and prospective buyers. She used philanthropic phrases to gloss over the pain she intended to cause. "Progress requires sacrifice," she said, and the words slid into the stairwell like daggers. The developers smiled, the cameras recorded, and a small crowd gathered to watch the spectacle of displacement. Bones' hands clenched. In the back of his throat, a small sob caught and did not fully emerge. His pride made him still. He stood like a man who had been trained in dignified endurance. When Lorraine turned her triumphant gaze toward him, she did what she had planned. She made him the cautionary tale. She named him as an example of those who would be left behind by the new skyline, the outdated tenants who were a blight on the city's progress and aesthetic. She laughed at him, and the laugh echoed in the stairwell. The cameras captured every humiliation. His torn jacket, the way his shoes had once been resoled, the small rattle in his daughter's toy that he kept tucked into his bag. The audience inhaled and exhaled with the cruel satisfaction of those who believe in their own superiority. Bone felt foolish and small, his chest tightening until he could hardly breathe. He thought of packing boxes, of explaining to Maya why a new place could not be found, of the lullaby he had promised to keep singing but might have to change. He felt worthless and exposed. And then, the world shifted, the way it sometimes does when a person of unusual power decides to correct a wrong. The hidden savior, who the public thought of as an impeccable CEO, stepped forward. Leonora Hale had arrived at the walkthrough not as a philanthropist but as a person who had quietly learned and observed. She saw the injustice and was shaken by a moral clarity she had not felt since before her grief had calcified. She moved through the crowd with a calm that made people step aside. Her presence was commanding and yet tender, like a polished hand that opens rather than clutches. She was calm but powerful, and the juxtaposition of corporate precision and human tenderness made the crowd hold its breath. Her entrance was not dramatic for the sake of spectacle. She entered like someone who had chosen a particular battle, with a measured step and a gaze that sought out Bone. The rain had returned, a soft cold drizzle that made the air taste of iron. She watched as Lorraine smeared the air with contempt and found it unbearable. She waited until Lorraine had finished her denunciation. Then she stepped forward. The silence that followed was a soft hush, one in which all teeth seemed to soften. In a voice that was clear, calm, and unadorned, Leonora introduced herself. "I am Leonora Hale," she said, and her name landed like a verdict. The cameras turned toward her, lights glinting off her sleek coat, but she did not speak from the stage of corporate theater. She spoke from a place of genuine outrage. She declared Lorraine's words unacceptable and rescinded the eviction rights on the condition that the developers engage in an equitable solution that recognized the dignity of existing tenants. Her statement felt like a powerful monologue as old as justice itself. She was a defender not because she needed to salvage appearances but because she had seen a human being humiliated and it pierced her. The crowd buzzed with the electricity of being witness to an unexpected reversal. Lorraine's face reddened with the slow burn of a woman who had been felled by a blow she did not see coming. Leonora did more than speak. She offered Bone a public pledge of support, an immediate fund to secure his housing, and an offer to personally oversee the community's transition plans to ensure they were fair. She announced, with the kind of directness that snapped like a conductor's baton, that her company would be creating an affordable housing plan and employment resources for those being displaced. She named Bone's dignity and used every resource she had to make the humiliation not merely mitigated but reversed. The crowd watched and the cameras spun the story into a headline. CEO steps in to defend displaced tenant. Bone felt his world tilt under the weight of public attention, his cheeks burning with the intensity of being saved and exposed all at once. It was overwhelming. Lorraine was left speechless, literally frozen. She had bet the world on cruelty and lost. She looked small in the glow of mended justice. Bone could do little but stand and receive. His heart thudded wildly, and his limbs trembled as gratitude and disbelief fought for space in his chest. He had been made a public spectacle and then unmagnified by grace. Leonora's smooth hand reached toward him in a gesture that was not theatrical but profoundly human. She offered him not only funds but something more difficult to accept, assurance that he would not be made invisible again. The city watched him as a hero of another kind. Not someone who had won riches but someone whose dignity had been reasserted by a stranger who had the power to do so. He felt his life being realigned, like a book whose spine had been mended and opened again. What the cameras did not capture was the way that, in that private arc of interaction, Leonora's face softened to reveal a grief that had long dwelled behind her corporate poise. She looked at Bone and saw in him the very humanity she thought she'd been protecting through philanthropy but had, in fact, missed. She had been moved by the sandwich and the folded dollar at the pump and by the steady courage she witnessed at the clinic. But it was the cruel public display that finally ripped her pretense away. She had been living in a world of polished surfaces, until she saw a man whose dignity had been made a spectacle. That sight had the power to change her more than any boardroom meeting could. She felt a quietness in her chest that suggested the possibility of a life that used power to heal rather than to punish. The moment ended with a very short sentence. He cried. Part 5. After the public rescue and the humiliating spectacle, things became complicated in ways that are often not captured by headlines. Bone, who had always kept his feelings tucked away like letters in a shoebox, found himself parading his gratitude in private like a worn cloak. He returned to his life with pockets a little fuller and a sense of being watched that he hated. The media had transformed the morning into a story that would be retold as a lesson about compassion and corporate responsibility, complete with glossy photos and captions that emphasized the contrast between philanthropy and cruelty. People texted him with opinions and lifelines. His neighbors offered casseroles and raises of eyebrows. He sat with Maya and read her stories about brave knights and gentle kings and felt like a paradox. A man who had been saved and a man who wanted above all else to be alone with his child's laughter. Leah returned to her office with a heart that thrummed against her ribs with a new purpose. She had not intended to make her identity known, but the spotlight made it unavoidable. Her company had to respond to public curiosity. The board spun short-term strategy and long-term optics. The press asked her to issue a statement. She did, but in private, she set about the difficult work of reconciling the person she had been with the person she wanted to be. She began to attend community meetings not as an observer but as a participant, insisting that corporate resources be used to create permanence, not just temporary respite. She hired social workers and listened to families define their own needs. She kept returning, night after night, because each meeting brought faces to the ledger she had started in private. Bone, despite the gift that saved him from the immediate eviction, faced more subtle consequences. The sense of being beholden, the sting of being made a symbol. He had to navigate offers of help that smelled of voyeurism. People who had never noticed him before now wanted photographs and stories. He tired quickly of being a headline. He wanted to be a father, not a cause. He also had to face practical things. Getting a new apartment in a market that favored higher bidders, ensuring Maya could keep her school, finding childcare that didn't cost a small fortune. Leonora, sensing the dissonance, tried to make amends with practical support that respected his dignity. She offered to connect him with local programs to fund a job placement and to help secure a new apartment without publicity. He accepted with hesitation. He accepted because he had a child to think of. He accepted because the world can be cruel and sometimes needed a sturdier hand. Their connection grew in small, hesitant moments. They had a conversation that evening in a dimly lit community center. A safe space with coffee that tasted like sturdiness and tables that had seen more good intentions than any other in the city. It was a moment designed by fate to allow them to speak honestly. It followed the pattern of the confession scene. They sat in a small, quiet corner where the light was dim and forgiving. Leonora told her story first with a tremor at the edges. She spoke of a life of public success and private emptiness. She told Bone of the accident that had stripped her of the person she loved. She talked about how work had become a way to avoid the ache of loss. When she spoke, she did not look away. Her eyes were unwavering, and for the first time, she allowed someone to witness her grief without needing to sanitize it. Bone listened with the kind of steady presence that had been honed by years of bedtime stories and scraped knees. He did not offer platitudes. He made her tea with hands that had learned to move around someone else's sorrow with respect. He did not try to fix what she described. He simply listened. When his turn came, he spoke of the small, daily grief of being a single father, the loneliness of meals eaten with an empty side of the table, the debt that never fully disappeared, the fear that his daughter's laughter might become quieter if he failed. He told her about the lullaby his mother hummed as she mended socks, and he spoke of the hope he folded into a crumpled receipt in his glove compartment. His confession was humble and deep. It had the power of someone who had survived by making his life a series of small vows. Their exchange was unremarkable in many ways and monumental in others. It ended with a hand on a shoulder, a mundane, symbolic touch that affirmed their shared humanity without turning the moment into a melodramatic confession. They left that night changed in small but undeniable ways. Their armor had been nudged and a seam had opened that allowed warmth to leak in. They began to spend time near each other. Leonora would sometimes volunteer at the clinic and watch Bone work, and Bone would sometimes attend a program at Hale Industries that Leonora had quietly initiated to help displaced families. Their relationship, initially structured by power dynamics, began to form a more tender architecture of equality, a place where money could be helpful without being intrusive. As they grew closer, Leonora's hidden grief slowly softened. She began, almost imperceptibly, to allow herself to feel joy in small things. Maya's laugh, Bone's unmanicured hands that held plates like sacred things, the aroma of a home-cooked meal. She found herself sitting on a couch, listening to a child's laugh, and feeling something in her chest that was not loneliness but a willingness to belong. Bone, for his part, had to reconcile accepting help with maintaining independence. He felt at times that the identity of the man who was saved was an awkward badge. He preferred the quieter identity of the father who keeps promises. Their conversations were careful and deliberate, designed to ensure that the balance of power never became oppressive. There were tender, humorous episodes that the media could never capture. Leonora learned how to soften a stubborn pancake batter to Maya's liking. Bone taught her how to fold a fitted sheet without shrieking in frustration. Little rituals grew between them. Bone reading the same children's book in different voices while Leonora brewed tea and considered the state of philanthropic accounting. They shared a bowl of cereal one morning, and Leonora, who had once only eaten alone at sleek tables, found that the scrape of a plastic spoon in a cheap bowl was a sound she came to love. Their worlds, once divided by corporate towers and low eaves, began to overlap like two maps aligning. But romance did not arrive as an abrupt declaration. It matured slowly, built on mutual understanding and shared sorrow. They both had griefs that required patience, not solutions. Leonora had a secret history she had not yet revealed in full. The detail of the partner she had lost included a complicated narrative about family expectations and media scrutiny. Bone had a secrecy as well, a lingering worry about whether he would ever be able to provide the kind of security his daughter deserved. Their courtship was not swift. It was a series of small gestures, of shared confidences, of nights spent listening to each other's breathing like the most sacred of lullabies. Gradually, they realized that their needs were complementary. Leonora had resources and a newfound humility. Bone had steadiness and an unglamorous depth of love. The city, meanwhile, watched them with a fascination that was part gossip and part hope. Headlines alternated between praise and skepticism. CEO marries community, declared one tabloid, while another argued a power imbalance could not be easily defied. They both tried to ignore the noise and keep their focus on the small, immediate matters at hand. Maya's piano lesson, the need for a warm blanket, the satisfaction of a job well done. They had both accepted that life can be a series of small battles, and their choice was to fight them together or not at all. Their confession scene had accomplished what speeches rarely do. It had opened a channel of vulnerability that allowed them to see the hollow places in each other's lives and not flinch. The revelation of Leonora's identity, done publicly during the rescue, had complicated matters, but it had also allowed for old wounds to be tended with new tools. Honesty, support, and a willingness to be seen without pretense. They were learning to answer grief not with strategy but with presence. They had built a kind of companionship that was not dramatic but solid, not performative but true. Part 6. The weeks after Leonora's public intervention were a liminal time when both characters learned to navigate the complexities of newfound attention and private healing. Bone's neighborhood slowly adjusted to having a benefactor whose intentions were sincere and who insisted on listening more than lecturing. Leonora's life, once measured by quarterly reports and impeccably scheduled meetings, began to measure itself by something else, the simple arithmetic of human needs. She brought Lees to job training programs, hired people who had talent but lacked opportunity, and funded community gardens that became little sanctuaries of green in the middle of gray buildings. At night, when the office lights dimmed and the city's breath slowed, Leonora would drive without destination, letting roads untangle the stiffness in her heart. She began to keep a small notebook where she wrote down the names of people who needed more than a press release. She learned the names of Bone's neighbors and asked about their small joys. She made a habit of writing anonymous checks not to look magnanimous but to keep her own humanity awake. Her life was not suddenly uncomplicated. Grief does not vanish because you give money. Instead, the money became a vehicle for a more practical tenderness that allowed real people to sleep under roofs that didn't leak. Bone, for his part, managed the tangle of gratitude, media attention, and practical adjustments with quiet artistry. He and Maya moved into a small apartment across town where the windows let in a golden glow at dawn. He painted the walls with childish shapes and hung pictures of dinosaurs that dominated the space with playful authority. He started a small side business, fixing bikes after work, that gave him extra income and a sense of agency. His pride, which had once been a barricade, softened into a modest confidence. He enjoyed simple pleasures, a cup of coffee shared with a friend, a chorus of laughter at a park. He also continued working at the clinic, where his presence mattered. His life, though still marked by difficulty, had an integrity he was proud of. Their romance grew in incremental but meaningful ways. It wasn't cinematic in the way movies portray love. It was domestic, lined with small acts that signified trust. Leonora learned how to become comfortable with the noise of a small child. Bone learned how to accept help without feeling indebted. They shared a slow affection, like a tune hummed under a half-sleeping sky. They took long walks down streets that still had old trees and quiet stoops. They visited thrift stores together, where Leonora learned how to look for treasures under secondhand dust, and Bone taught her to bargain like a wise person. The story, however, needed a moment of seismic truth, one that was a pivot from rescue to romantic fulfillment. This climax would need to be public and grand because the universe had designed a stage that required all the heroic chords to be struck. The antagonist, Lorraine, humiliated and enraged by her loss of control and influence, decided to retaliate not by legal means, but by a public spectacle that would ensure Bone's name was again dragged through gossip and ridicule. She had the kind of cruelty that enjoys spectacle. She planned an event to label Bone a fraud, accusing him of accepting charity and not worth the compassion he had received. It was petty, calculated, and foretold doom for a humble man with a small child. She rented a space, hired social media influencers, and prepared a smear campaign. She thrived on the idea that tearing someone down in public was an affirmation of her own superiority. Her plan was to show the world that the humble man was not worthy of salvation. On the day Lorraine unleashed her venom, the town square became a theater for cruelty. Lorraine's team set up booths and microphones. Cameras were rolling. The city hummed with a curiosity for scandal. Bone was invited coerced into what was meant to be a show trial, where Lorraine would reveal truths that would embarrass him further. He walked into the square with the same dignity he had when he faced the initial eviction notice. He had been through humiliation before and had learned to resist being obliterated by it. He kept his face level and his voice steady. He thought of his daughter, of the lullaby, and of the promise he had made to keep her safe. The event began with Lorraine's grand, bullying speech about frauds and fair play. She painted Bone as an opportunist using public sympathy to leech off corporate charity. Her words were sharp and cruel. The crowd, eager for sensation, leaned in. Bone felt the sting of being stripped once more and realized he could be forced into the center of attention in ways he had not consented to. His chest tightened and his hands shook as old memories rose like a tide. He regretted being vulnerable in a world that saw vulnerability as performance. He was made to look small, a puppet with strings pulled by a woman who loved to make others dance. And then, like a lighthouse in a storm, Leonora cut through the noise. Her entrance was commanding. She had rehearsed no monologue. Instead, she had prepared truth. She stepped into the square and faced Lorraine with such composure that the crowd's murmur fell into a hush. She did not shout. Instead, she told the story of the sandwich, the pump, the clinic, and how witnessing an act of pure kindness had changed her. She spoke of her own grief and how it had made her numb to the tenderness of others. She then spoke directly to the crowd and to Lorraine. Money is a tool, and tools must be wielded with the intention to build, not to humiliate. Her words were like a pivot that realigned social gravity. She removed the dynamics of spectacle and reasserted the moral thread that had the power to reorder priorities. Her revelation was not only verbal. She presented evidence. Documents showing the anonymous donations she'd made, statements in which she'd insisted on privacy, and proof that her gestures had been intended to preserve dignity, not produce headlines. She exposed Lorraine's smear as a petty stunt intended to generate scandal and distract from real issues. Lorraine sputtered and spluttered, her composure fracturing under the weight of a woman who refused to be cowed. The crowd, awash with the conflicting currents of sympathy and schadenfreude, began to sway in a new direction. People who had come for entertainment found that the heart had its own show to offer, an act of quiet redemption that was both moral and practical. And then, in a moment that would be written about in quiet margins, Leonora stepped forward and publicly offered Bone and his daughter a permanent solution. She purchased a modest house in the neighborhood, insisted that it remain affordable for community members, and promised funding for after-school programs. She offered Bone a job at a new community center that matched his skills of care and practical repair. She spoke not as a CEO writing a press release, but as a person who had learned to use the leverage of her position to heal, rather than to command. The crowd watched as the balance of power shifted. Lorraine had been publicly undone. She left the square small and silenced, her performance of cruelty no longer triumphant. Bone's cheeks shone with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The scene concluded with a very short, declarative beat. He smiled. Part 7. The resolution that followed was not instant perfection but an emotional reweaving of lives. Bone and Leonora now had to navigate a new normal where money, power, and humility coexisted within shared rooms and shared responsibilities. The community center Leonora funded became a hub of modest miracles. It offered job training, after-school programming, and a place where neighbors could gather over soup and plan community gardens. Bone ran the bike repair workshop and taught kids how to fix things that mattered: bikes, small engines, and sometimes metaphorically broken confidence. He found that his hands, which had always been steady, had gifts that could be taught. He derived a slow, stubborn pride from helping someone learn to use a wrench. Leonora, stepping out of the top-floor glass and into the neighborhood, had to adjust to a life of less curated aesthetics and more living textures. She found joy in ordinary things. The way Maya would place sticky drawings on her office wall, the sound of laughter in the community center, the mud that showed up on shoes and on hands as proof of engagement. She no longer treated charity as an expense line item but as a relationship. She hired staff who had grown up in the area and allowed them to guide the projects. She listened to residents' demands and implemented policies that made housing secure not as a charitable extra but as a structural right within her domain. She used wealth the way a gardener uses water, to nourish, not to drown. Bone and Leonora's relationship matured into something that blended romance and family in a way that did not erase the complexities of their pasts. He proposed in a manner that was both humble and full of intention. Not on bended knee in a dramatic setting but in their kitchen, with Maya asleep in a nearby room and the dishwater humming. He offered her a simple ring he'd saved up for in slow increments, a ring she admired for its unvarnished truth. She said yes with tears she did not polish. Their wedding was a community affair, a potluck and a gentle ceremony at the community center where the benches creaked with stories and the air was filled with the scent of home-cooked food. It felt like a manifesto. Love that is not flashy, that chooses to be practical and soft, that insists on being human. The public, predictably, had opinions. Some suggested the marriage a public stunt, an opportunistic blend of interest and narrative. Those voices existed on the margins, chewing the same stale gossip they'd always enjoyed. But most of the neighborhood celebrated with a sincere joy that wasn't contingent on whether the story would trend. They cared because their own lives intersected with the new reality. The apartment buildings had dedicated funding, kids had classes, and neighbors had jobs. There is a kind of municipal happiness that grows from stability. That happiness was quiet and deep. In the privacy of their union, Bone and Leonora had to face residuals of their past wounds. Leonora still sometimes woke at night with the phantom ache of past loss. Bone still had days where his chest felt heavy with the memory of marginalization. They took turns being the steady one, sometimes offering an unflinching presence and sometimes accepting care. They developed rituals that allowed them to recalibrate. A weekly soup night for neighbors, a careful budgeting session where Leonora taught Bone investment basics and learned to fold fast, and an unwieldy habit of attending local events without press. They created a pledge to always ask permission before making someone struggle public. A tiny policy born out of tenderness and diplomacy. Their romantic fulfillment was not a conquest but a covenant. Leonora offered Bone not only her wealth but her ability to listen and to do the work of repair. Bone offered Leonora not simply his steady presence but an unvarnished view of joy that didn't require a press release. Maya, whose laughter had once been the only priority in each of Bone's decisions, now had new friends and new spaces to sing and play. She learned to call Leonora Lena, a name she invented in a child's wisdom that changed Leonora's heart with ease. The antagonist, Lorraine, found herself left to reckon with the small and terrible consequence of being unkind. She retreated into private corners where her public fantasies could no longer be exercised upon others. She tried, foolishly, to buy another headline, but the city had shifted its appetite. People favored practicality. Lorraine's attempts at later philanthropy felt sour because they lacked the humility and attention that made Leonora's earlier acts meaningful. Her collapse was eventually complete, and she retreated into a life where influence became a hollow echo. Bone's life settled into a rhythm of persistence and pleasure. He fixed bikes and taught kids, held down a lovely, warming presence in a house that, by daylight, smelled of cinnamon. He wrote a note for his glove compartment. "We did it for love," Maya flourished. She was a small constellation that made the house feel worth everything. Leonora, whose wealth had been an instrument of private solitude, had learned how to play it as a symphony. She funded initiatives that lasted beyond photo ops and gave authority to those who had earned it. She learned to sleep without running spreadsheets in her head. Part 8. The year that followed was an exercise in the quiet joys of reconstruction. The affordable housing initiative Leonora had insisted on was in place, and a little park with a bike track became an emblem of the community's persistence. Bone ran bike workshops every Saturday. Kids learned to find confidence in grease-smudged hands. The community center had a small library with books donated by corporations and neighbors alike. Leonora had set up a small scholarship fund in Maya's name for creative pursuits. There were murals that depicted not only the past but a hopeful future. Paintings of waves, of strong hands, of locked fences opened. The images became an archive of both struggle and triumph, and children learned to read their town's map in color. The daily scene at home had a gentle, steady bliss. Leonora took up baking because she loved the precise alchemy of flour and sugar and being able to give away loaves as easily as writing a check. Bone taught her how to thread a needle and how to laugh with the kind of loud, honest amusement that made the cat leap off the windowsill. Their life was not free of pain. There were nights when Leonora would sit and be swallowed by memories, when Bone would have to be the one who carried silence like a quilt. They supported each other's griefs with the tender truth of people who had been rebuilt by small mercy. They celebrated little milestones. Maya's first piano recital where Leonora cried until her cheeks were damp. Bone's 40th birthday, where a potluck turned into a tribute to the steady hands that had fixed countless bikes for free. A neighborhood harvest festival where the park buzzed like a beehive of joy. Each celebration was imbued with an awareness that none of it had been guaranteed. The memory of Lorraine's public cruelty receded not because it had been erased but because it had been countered with acts of persistent kindness. The community, once at risk of being reshaped by developers, became resilient in its own right. Lee's work at Hale Industries shifted subtly but persistently. She implemented programs that favored community-led development, advocated for housing security, and insisted that the company be accountable not only to stockholders but to neighbors. The corporate board, initially skeptical, began to see the practical benefits of stability. Employees who lived nearby were more productive, the brand's reputation improved, and the neighborhood's well-being created a better pool of talent. The narrative that civic compassion and corporate steadiness were incompatible crumbled under the weight of practical evidence. The company moved from being a corporate entity to being an institution that had a moral stake in the city's future. Bone's own small business grew into a modest cooperative of bike repair and mechanical education. He hired teens who had limited prospects and trained them in trades that had value beyond the market. He taught them how to fix not only bikes but their confidence. The cooperative created a sustainable model for local employment. People started to rely on the community center for more than free food, for opportunities, for dignity, for a place to sleep in winter. The city noticed and, in a slow cascade of attention, began to replicate the model in other neighborhoods. Small victories became a blueprint for more equitable urban development. The tenderness between Bone and Leonora deepened. They sometimes visited the pump where they had met, not to relive drama but to breathe the place that had been a turning point, the place where a simple act had rippled into a life. They walked hand in hand down quiet streets, their fingers interlaced the way two people might stitch together a promise. Their conversations no longer had to be about survival. They could speak of dreams. A cottage by the water, a garden that grew food for neighbors, a school with a music room. Their marriage had become an emblem of two people who had learned to love not in spite of their pasts but because of them. The year brought challenges as well. Regulatory hurdles, city bureaucracy, and the stubbornness of some who resisted change ensured that no victory was permanent. There were days when Bone and Leonora would argue not about love but about how to manage power responsibly. She sometimes misstepped into patronizing tones. He sometimes retreated into private silence when he felt overwhelmed by offers of help. They weathered these moments with humility and a willingness to learn. They went to counseling not because their love was in trouble but because they wanted to grow strong enough to be anchors for others. Their capacity to seek help was a testament to their maturity. The antagonist, Lorraine, found her influence in decline. She tried to regain footing through a personal campaign to be seen as reformed and generous. But without the tenderness of true contrition, her attempts felt hollow. People forgave eventually, but they also kept watch. Her story was that of someone who had to reckon with an ethical bankruptcy that money could not pay for. She was not destroyed. She was forced into a life where she could no longer use cruelty as a social currency. This was a kind of justice, not a public execution but a private re-education. At the close of the year, on a mild autumn evening, Bone, Leonora, and Maya stood in the park that had once been a lot of empty concrete. The air smelled of wet earth and leaves, and children ran in circles, their laughter a hymn. They watched as the community gathered for a simple festival celebrating the park's completion. They held hands and felt a kind of domestic peace that was neither accidental nor permanent but carefully constructed. They had not solved every injustice in the world, but they had built a small island of tenderness against the tides. Part 9. The story, which had stitched together the lives of two very different people with small acts of courage, now reached a moral that the narrator felt compelled to deliver directly to you, the reader. The events that had transpired were not merely anecdotal. They were fables that spoke to a larger truth. Kindness given without expectation can change lives, and power wielded with humility can heal wounds that money alone cannot reach. The narrator intends to remind you that, in the messy ledger of human life, a sandwich handed to a stranger can be more valuable than many speeches. Can be a seed. It can be the beginning of reawakened purpose. Can be the hinge of transformation. If this story touched your heart, you must know that these characters were crafted to remind you that the ordinary world is full of moments where you can be an agent of dignity. You may not have the resources of a CEO, but you have the ability to notice, to respond, to offer a folded dollar, a warm meal, or simply an unwavering presence. The virtuous sufferer, the man who gives the last of his coin, shows us that dignity can be the architecture of survival. The hidden savior demonstrates that wealth without tenderness is shallow and that grief can be healed through small acts of courage. The antagonist warns us that cruelty is public and performative, but it can also be countered by quiet perseverance and moral clarity. In this story, faith in human goodness becomes the currency by which change happens. It is not a naive faith, it is a tested one. The world will at times seek to humiliate and to compress people into headlines. The people who act with steady, sober kindness, who offer a meal instead of a sermon, are the ones who refill the world with possibility. They teach us that being saved is not a matter of spectacle but of presence. When a powerful person chooses to use resources to stabilize rather than to dominate, a community can breathe. The narrative is not a fairy tale. It is a practical blueprint for moral action. If you feel moved, you should not merely feel, you should act. The lessons are plain. Notice the person at the pump, the weary face under a train line, the small child holding a tattered toy. Consider giving more than money. Give your time, your attention, your willingness to listen. If you are in a position of power, consider the ways your resources can be used to create permanence, to fund structures that last beyond the headlines, and to support dignity over spectacle. Small, sincere acts can lead to large, sustained change. Do not be discouraged if your gestures are unseen. The most profound effects often begin in private. This story is an affirmation that the currency of compassion is always valuable, and it returns in ways that are not always predictable but always meaningful. Part 10. 1 year later, everything looked, for the most part, entirely and gently healed. The house that Leonora had purchased for Bone had a small porch with a swing that creaked amicably. The curtains were patched by Mrs. Lopez. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon at breakfast. Maya skipped into school with a backpack a size too large, humming songs she had learned in after-school music class funded by Leonora's initiative. Bone's bike coupe had a sign that read Maya and Company. Bikes. Painted not by professionals but by neighborhood kids. Leonora kept her office but also kept a small desk at the community center, where she could be reached without secrecy. The board at Hale Industries had learned to consult with community representatives, and some of the company's projects were now co-owned with local residents. The city recognized the community center as a model. The news occasionally revisited the rescue story in anniversary pieces, but the narrative had become less about spectacle and more about systems. Bone and Leonora had become a peculiar, beloved fixture in their neighborhood. The couple who made good on a vow to love the street as much as each other. They had a Sunday ritual of inviting anyone who needed a meal to join them for soup and conversation. On the table were leftovers turned into masterpieces, and everyone ate like royalty. They hosted workshops about financial literacy taught by Leonora and practical crafts taught by Bone. They had learned to partner their different strengths in ways that respected dignity. The CEO who could sign a check and the janitor who could teach a kid to tighten a chain now codified protocols that prevented displacement. Their love, while sentimental, had also been practical. It rebuilt a neighborhood with small, durable interventions. The small antagonists who sought to profit from displacement either changed or faded. Lorraine moved away to a suburb where she could preside over a different kind of community, one less likely to offer immediate moral pushes, and had occasional moments when the absence of public drama felt like an emptiness she hadn't planned on. She sometimes wrote letters attempting small acts of atonement, which were met with polite but guarded responses. Forgiveness had been given where it felt genuine, not because it was convenient for the narrative. The neighborhood had healed, but healing was not uniform. The story had been messy as healing usually is. The final months were dedicated to building legacies. Leonora and Bone collaborated on the Maya Fund, a scholarship for creative and vocational arts for local children, and it became an institution that helped dozens of kids over the years learn trades, music, and the art of civic engagement. The community centers by Cooperative grew into a small business that helped the city with sustainable mobility solutions. These projects proved that the seed of a sandwich and a folded dollar could become a grove of tangible outcomes. They proved that kindness, when stewarded with responsibility and love, produced systemic benefits. They also proved that grief could become a source of motivation when it was directed toward communal healing. One evening, as autumn creased the edges of the year with orange and gold, Bone and Leonora sat on their porch swing and watched Maya chase fireflies in the yard. The air smelled of wet earth and fried dough from the festival across the street. The bench was warm with the memory of bodies that had lived and loved there. Bone had his arm around Leonora, and she leaned into him with quiet gratitude. The world was not perfect, but it was softer. If this story touched your heart, please consider what you can do in your own life to be that steady hand. Notice the people who might be invisible in your day. Someone at a gas station who looks lost, a neighbor whose rent is overdue, a child who needs after-school support. Sometimes the most meaningful acts are the smallest. A sandwich, a folded dollar, an offer to listen. Change does not always happen in grand gestures. More often, it begins in private moments where people choose to do the right thing without an audience. And if you are in a place of influence, consider directing your power to build stability rather than spectacle. Like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales for more soul-stirring, heartwarming, and inspiring stories about the power of compassion and the miracles that come from small acts of kindness. We'll see you in the next one.